Chapter 1. The Coming of Immigrants, 1830s, Hickory tea. Euphemism for a whipping. Some hickory tea would straighten the child up. For clarity, an immigrant refers to a person arriving in their new country, and emigrant refers to a person moving from a country. While the words have been used interchangeably by writers over the years, immigrate stresses entering a country and emigrate stresses leaving a country. Farming in the Highlands of Scotland began to shift toward a potato-based diet starting in about 1815. This continued for several years until a blight swept across Ireland and Scotland that rotted the vines and destroyed the crop. The Highland Potato Famine, 1846-1856, resulted in their important food source being devastated by the potato blight. It was part of a larger food crisis in Northern Europe, which had become over-reliant on potatoes for subsistence. Ireland suffered the most, and many poor Irish immigrated to America in search of opportunity. During the famine, up to a third of the Scottish Western Highlanders emigrated to other lands. As many as 16,000 of the poor who had enough money to buy a fare, along with several others given free passage on ships by the charity of landlords, left their motherland. The worst and most improvised Scots emigrants were from the islands of Barra and South Uist, which is on the western side of Scotland. They were described as being in a state of nudity and utter helplessness when many arrived in Canada. From the years of 1841 to 1931, about 2 million Scots migrated to North America and Australia. Our story in this book begins in the mid-1830s in the hills of Tennessee. It was during the second term of the 7th President of the United States, Andrew Jackson. He was nicknamed Old Hickory for his strict and crude handling of soldiers before becoming president. Anyone with knowledge about wood knows that hickory is strong and tough. Hickory was used for handles in tools, and it made a good switch that didn't break easily. An expression for someone who needed discipline was that they needed some hickory tea. It was a known cure for children that were out of compliance. The hills of Tennessee were plentiful with hickory trees. The immigrants crossed over the Appalachian Mountains from the coastal lands and settled into the region west of the mountains, where they became known for their endurance and ability to scratch out a subsistence from the rocky soil. Most cabins were built using logs and mud and a fireplace for heat and cooking. Few nails were used in the construction of their log homes, having small window openings with only wooden shutters and no glass. Without nails, their roofs were shingled by using a layer of split boards held by poles with flat rocks on top. These poor settlers were proud to be in a place where they felt free and able to live off the new land. Many hardships suffered in the motherland had tempered them for life on the frontier. On October 23, 1834, a daughter was born into the Renfro family and given the name Jane Virginia Renfro. She was known and admired by all as Jenny, and later as Aunt Jenny. The Renfro clan was from Scotland and is connected to the town of Renfrewshire. The spelling of her name Jenny is on her tombstone, but I prefer to spell it as our daughter's name is spelled with a Y. Jenny is a shortened name for Virginia, a common name from Latin meaning a maiden. The first English-born child in America was named Virginia Dare, born August 18, 1587, in the Roanoke Colony, coast of North Carolina. On Christmas Day, December 25th, in 1835, a boy was born to an English family named Alexander Harness. He was called Alec for short, and was born in Tennessee. Records are lacking or questionable about his parents and early history. Perhaps time and research will reveal more in the future. His surname, Alexander, comes from early Greek history, Alexander the Great. But later, from the motherland of Scotland, the name Alexander was prominent among Highlanders. Jenny's father was Mark Renfro, who was born in Tennessee in 1805 and is listed in the 1830 Perry County, Tennessee census. He married Elizabeth Hensley, and the couple moved to Arkansas between 1837 and 1839. To them was born these children while living in Tennessee and later in Arkansas: Charlotte B. Perry County, TN; Joshua Benjamin B. Perry County, TN; Virginia Jane, Jenny B. Wayne County, TN; Nathaniel, TN, died in Civil War. 1860 census, Searcy Co., married Mary; Joseph Leander B. Octet 15, Lawrence, A.R., 1839. He married Martha Ann Bradley November 18, 1863, in Searcy County, Arkansas. Mark Renfro died in 1839 in Lawrence County, Arkansas, and his widow, Elizabeth Annie Hensley Renfro, remarried James Hughes in Searcy County, Arkansas. This was commonly practiced as a widow had few options for survival when her husband died. Alexander Harness and Virginia Renfro survived as children in a time of countless dangers and elements when many perished. The Cumberland Plateau stretches from the north in Kentucky and down across Tennessee. Plenty of land was available to the immigrants settling there, but the population grew very rapidly. It is possible that with less land to farm, the growing number of settlers caused the younger Harness and Renfro families to go west. Cotton and tobacco were major crops in Tennessee, and many slaves were brought in to work in the fields. Although corn was an important crop for human consumption and feeding livestock, both Tennessee and Kentucky became famous for corn whiskey made and aged in white oak barrels. It is unknown when or how Alec and Jenny met as young adults, but according to one record I found, they were married in 1855 in Tennessee. Many marriages in Tennessee and other southern states in the 1800s began with a bond being given as security that there was no unlawful cause to prevent the marriage. Due to the scarcity of ministers, the bond was made to the county clerk. No money changed hands at the time the bond was issued, but a male friend or relative signed as the groom's security for the bond. This person was commonly known as a bondsman. If the groom was sued for violating the marriage contract, the bondsman, best man, would have to pay any legal damages for the default. The bond of matrimony was not always a religious act, and a wedding party was seldom, given the poverty of many families. A son was born to Alexander and Jenny Harness on October 28, 1856. The boy was named Martin Van Buren Josar Harness, but he was called Mart for short. Jenny had just turned 22 years old when Mart was born. Martin was a common name among many prominent men of that time. I discovered one named William Alexander Parsons Martin, 1827-1916, who was an American Presbyterian missionary to China, known for his translation of religious works in both Chinese and Japanese. The names William, Alexander, and Martin were all used in the Harness clan. Then 2 years later, Jenny gave birth to a second son they named William Alexander Harness, who was called Billy, born October 29, 1858. Neither Alec nor Jenny understood how important those two small boys would be in helping the family survive in the years to come. In less than 2 years, The father died, and Jenny was left a widow to raise two boys. Large families of 6 or more were the rule, and a family of only 2 children was considered small. Birthing was dangerous and painful, as many mothers and babies perished in the process. Yet there were 2 healthy boys in the Alexander Harness family in the fall of 1858. It is unknown when the Harness couple relocated to the land west of the Mississippi River, but statehood was granted to that territory on June 15, 1836, and it was named Arkansas. If they journeyed to Memphis, they could have crossed the mighty Mississippi River on a boat or ferry. The river was a formidable obstacle to anyone going west. Crossing was dangerous, and usually the ferry was backed up, sometimes for days, as it was the only way to get across. Ellis and Jenny may have had to cross other rivers by ferry on their trip to the Ozark Hills. Early ferries used ropes and horses on the shores to pull the barge across. The settlement of St. Louis received the first bridge across the mighty Mississippi in 1874, but it was years later for Memphis. Ferried people crossing from Memphis landed at Hope Field or Mound City, once bustling towns on the Arkansas side of the river. Near West Memphis today, the town of Hope Field was ordered by General Stephen Hurlbut to be burned to combat rebels in the area during the Civil War. It was rebuilt, but then hit by a series of yellow fever epidemics and diminished by erosion. Nearby, Mound City was named for the Indian mounds in the area. It, too, was burned by the Union Army. Neither town had docks for the ferry, only a shore where people and goods could disembark. I was curious how much it would cost to ferry across the river at Memphis, but couldn't find any information. I did find a listing of fees for the Missouri River in 1825. Here are the rates. Loaded wagon and team, $2. Empty wagon and team, $1. Dearborn and horses, or gig and horses, 62.14 cents. Man and horse, 37.12 cents. Single person, 18.18 cents. Horses each, 18.14 cents. Sheep, hogs, and cattle, each 3 cents. Charges were regulated by the division of the old Spanish dollar into bits. A bit was 12 to 2 cents, a bit and a half, 18 3 to 4 cents, 2 bits, 25 cents, 4 bits, 50 cents, and 8 bits a dollar. Gatewood, History of Clay and Platte Counties, Missouri, P.O. 113. Deatheridge, History of Greater Kansas City, pp. 187, 188. Billy and Jenny first passed through the rich Delta farms along the Mississippi River that had developed cotton plantations on their way to the western hills of Arkansas. In those days, river traffic was the most practical way to traverse the state. The White River brought some of the first settlers to the northern region in the early 1800s. Jacob Wolfe built a log house in 1825 at the forks of the White and Norfolk Rivers, Baxter County, which still stands. The Old Southwest Trail, also known as the National Road and the Old Military Road, was one of the first permanent roads across Arkansas. Both Confederate and Union Army forces used that road during the Civil War. The Harness couple probably came up a tributary of the White River called the Buffalo River into Searcy County. There they found land in a hollow of Bear Creek and began a new life in the Ozark Hills. Land in North Arkansas was surveyed in the late 1830s and early 40s. Some of the earliest newcomers to the area settled on creek-bottom land where they farmed and built log homes. Robert Adams is believed to have been one of the first to settle on Holstead Creek, a small tributary on Upper Bear Creek, in the late 1820s in the community of Canaan. 100 years later, in 1924, Mary Pauline Horton, wife of Charles Clifford Harness, was born in this area to Andrew and Cora Horton. So many Hortons lived in the area that it was nicknamed Horton Bend. Originally, the Ozark Mountains was known for its large black bear population, and Arkansas was named the Bear State. In those early days, hunters killed the black bear for food and hide. Smoking bear meat allowed for storage and keeping for the winter months, and the fat was rendered and prized for many uses. The hollow where Ellis and Jenny built their cabin was at the western base of a high point called Bear Mountain. Water was plentiful, and timber covered the rocky and hilly land. They would have had to work hard at making their homestead successful. Log houses were first built in the Americas by immigrants from Sweden and Finland. That style of building had been used in those countries for hundreds of years. One man working alone could build a small cabin in a few weeks, but with some help, the work was cut in half. If the walls and roof were high enough, a loft was built for extra space of sleeping. If the cabin was built upon the ground, it had a dirt floor. If it was built on stacked rocks, allowing for split logs up off the ground, it had what was called a puncheon floor. The front door, built with smaller puncheon logs, wood hinges, and a latch, was usually facing to the south to allow the sun to shine into the cabin during the day. Bear grease or hog fat was used to grease the hinges. After getting a family into a safe and dry space, a fireplace, constructed of smaller logs, rocks, and clay mud, was added on the end of the house. Using clay mixed with straw, the gaps between the logs were chinked, and the fireplace was plastered with mud to prevent it from burning the wood structure. Felling trees, getting them to the site, and hoisting the logs to make walls and a roof was hard work. Without nails, a cabin could be constructed and held with notches, lashings, and daubing. Early Ozark cabins did not have porches, which were the design of slaves in the Deep South. Ellick would have been proficient at using an axe to chop down trees and a hand saw to cut the logs into lengths. Firewood was always in demand for cooking and heating water. In cold weather, it took lots of firewood to keep a cabin warm. The land where the Harness couple built their cabin was covered in trees, and all land deemed to be farmable was cleared for cultivation. Rocks were removed and stacked at the field edges for a rock fence. Some of the rocks that Ellick and Jenny removed and stacked up are still visible today. It was critical that a vegetable garden and cornfield be productive in the growing season to keep the family and livestock fed. It's hard to know how much help the two boys were in the short years that their daddy was with them, but children had the task of fetching water and wood and working in the field at an early age. Everyone who was able had chores, as all lived with the threat of starvation if they failed to succeed. Living off the land was about survival, and each day required hard work to subsist. For clothing, a gown was worn by infants and toddlers. Around the age of 5, girls wore dresses, and boys wore pants and a shirt. In cold weather, shoes and layers were added, and in warmer weather, less layers and bare feet were common. The greatest asset for a homesteader was to have a work animal. It could be an ox or a horse, but the choice became the mule many years later. Early census records show that it was horses, not mules, being used during the 1800s in Searcy County. Work animals pulled the plow and hauled heavy burdens as well as providing transportation, but walking from place to place and carrying an armload of supplies or carrying a child under one arm was commonplace. Steep hills around the Harness homestead required strong legs and strong bodies if enough nourishment could be found. It was hard for mountain folks to have too many calories in those days. A common breakfast menu might have included some of the following: cold cornbread, leftover stew, boiled or fried eggs, bacon, hog sausage, fried potatoes, and occasionally biscuits or gravy. No food went to waste, and everyone was glad if there was something to eat. Reflection. Every generation alive today came by way of parentage that sometimes hung by a thin thread. The inception of the Alexander Harness family was brief and separated by unexpected death, but a small remnant survived and grew into a large clan. Presbyterians were staunch believers in God's providence, and time shows how providential life was for our clan. Know I am with you, and I will watch over you no matter where you go. I will not leave you until I have done all I have promised you. Genesis 28:15. End note. The 1840 census recorded 936 white citizens in Searcy County, 150 of whom were males subject to the poll tax, as well as 3 slaves. The county also boasted 1 distillery owned by John S. Izell, 1 pleasure carriage owned by L.D. Jenkins, 1 mule, 311 horses and mares, 498 neat cattle, and 3,000 in merchandise capital. Land was finally offered for sale, and the first 3 legitimate purchasers came forward in 1841. Lemuel Turney purchased 73 acres, Thomas R. Hill bought 80 acres, and John M. Hensley purchased 72 acres. The frontier county continued to grow at a respectable pace through the 1840s, and survey maps of the period began to show that the county's traces had turned into bona fide roads. James J. Johnston, Searcy County, Arkansas, to 1850. Fayetteville, Arkansas, self-published, 1991. PAG 9. Explanations. Poll tax equals a flat tax upon every adult in a house. Slaves too expensive for hill farmers to own. Distillery. No regulations or restrictions existed. Mule. Unpopular, but breeding would improve in time. Mare. Considered best for gentle nature and reproduction. Neat cattle. Chows, clean and pastured animals, no hogs counted. Chow. Owned land. Before 1840s and afterward, squatters settled on unclaimed land. Perry Ray Harness, results from DNA test. Scots, English, and Irish made up 80% of his heritage. Scots blood is our dominant ancestry.